There is a kind of dislike that arrives before you have any reason for it. You meet someone or you watch someone from across a room and something inside you tightens. Not anger exactly, not quite judgment, just a low, persistent resistance. A subtle pull away from them, and if someone asked you to explain it, you probably could. You would find reasons, the way they talk, the way they carry themselves, something they said that time, something about how much space they take up. The reasons feel real, and maybe some of them are, but there is a version of this story you have not looked at yet. A version where the person you cannot stand is not the problem you think they are. A version where the discomfort you feel around them is not really about them at all. That version is harder to sit with. It asks something you may not be ready to give, not sympathy for them, not forgiveness. Just a quiet willingness to look at what it is inside yourself that they keep touching. There was someone at work, not a close colleague, just someone in the same orbit. Someone who appeared in meetings, who spoke often, who seemed entirely comfortable being seen. And from nearly the beginning, there was this reaction. A tension that arrived whenever they entered a room, a kind of inner rolling of the eyes, a low-grade irritation that was hard to explain but impossible to ignore. The person was not cruel, not incompetent. By any observable measure, they were doing their job and doing it reasonably well. But there was something about them that grated. The way they spoke with confidence even when they might be wrong. The way they offered ideas freely, without apparent fear of how those ideas would land. The way they seemed untroubled by the opinion of the room. And it was that last part maybe that stuck, the ease. The visible ease of just being themselves. For a long time, the reaction felt justified. There was always something to point to, a comment that went on too long, an idea that was half-formed, a certain quality of self-assurance that seemed to tip into arrogance. These were the reasons. They were filed away and returned to quietly whenever the irritation needed somewhere to sit. Months passed, the work continued. The tension continued, subtle enough that no one would have noticed, strong enough that it was always there like background noise that never quite fades. At some point, something shifts, not outwardly, inwardly. It is one of those moments that arrives without invitation. A quiet evening, no real distraction, and a thought that surfaces unexpectedly. Not a profound thought, just a small, insistent one. Why exactly does this bother me so much? Not in the way that question is usually asked, angled toward confirmation of the reasons already stored, but genuinely, honestly, like actually sitting down with it instead of passing through it. One voice comes forward first, the familiar one, the one that has been building the case for months. It arrives prepared. The comments that went on too long, the ideas that were half-formed, the way they fill a room with themselves as if the room invited it, the confidence that seems to skip the step where you check whether you have earned it. That voice knows the evidence well and can arrange it efficiently. And for a moment, that feels like enough. The case holds. The irritation is reasonable. There is nothing here that requires looking further. But then there is the other voice, the quieter one, the one that does not argue exactly but observes. And what it observes is something the first voice cannot easily explain away. The intensity. The irritation has been unusually consistent, more consistent than the evidence would predict. If this were simply about someone who was difficult or grating in ordinary ways, the feeling would have leveled out by now. Difficult people fade into background. You learn to manage them. You stop carrying the feeling home. But this has not leveled out. If anything, it has sharpened. And the parts that grate the most are not the weakest parts of this person. They are the most visible ones, the ease, the willingness to be seen. The way they seem entirely at peace with the fact that not everyone in the room will agree with them and appear to have made that peace a long time ago. That is the part that keeps snagging. And the quiet voice asks very carefully, is that something you are angry at, or something you are afraid of? There is a pause, a long one. The first voice does not have a clean answer for that. It reaches for one and finds mostly silence. So the mind does what minds are trained to do when something uncomfortable gets too close. It adjusts. It does not abandon the case. It reinforces it, adds new entries, pays sharper attention to every small moment of overconfidence, every comment that runs slightly too long, every instance of that ease appearing where it might be read as carelessness. The file grows thicker. The justification begins to feel airtight. And alongside the evidence, a comfortable story forms. The story where the irritation is not a reaction but a judgment, where it is simply discernment. The ability to read a room accurately, to see through performance, to recognize a certain kind of self-inflation for what it is. Where discomfort is not a symptom but a signal, a reliable one. This is what protection feels like from the inside. It does not present itself as protection. It presents itself as clarity. The mind is very good at this, at taking something that is essentially defensive and giving it the appearance of wisdom. It happens so smoothly that you rarely notice the transition. One moment you are uncomfortable. The next moment you have a theory. But the protection does not fully hold, because somewhere in the quieter moments, in the evenings, in the early mornings before everything starts again, a different kind of discomfort keeps surfacing, one that is harder to redirect. It is not about them. It is about something older, something that predates this job, this office, this particular person. It is about the years of measuring your words before offering them, the habit of checking the temperature of a room before deciding how much of yourself to bring into it. The long, practiced art of making sure what you say has been vetted enough, refined enough, safe enough, before it crosses the threshold from thought to speech. It is about the ideas that stayed inside because the timing never felt right. The opinions held back because they might have landed awkwardly, or taken up too much space, or drawn a kind of attention that felt more like exposure than recognition. The version of yourself that has been edited for years now, not all at once but gradually, like a slow revision that eventually starts to resemble the original. And the cost of that editing is not nothing. It is a particular kind of fatigue, the kind that does not show up as tired exactly, but as a low, persistent flatness. A sense of being slightly behind your own life, watching it rather than filling it. That is the discomfort that keeps surfacing, and it has nothing to do with the person at work, except that every time they walk into a room and take up their space without first asking permission, the discomfort flares up again. Brighter than it should, more personal than it has any right to be. Carl Jung wrote about something he called the shadow, not as a metaphor for darkness or moral failure, more as a simple, structural description of what happens to the parts of a person that do not fit the image they need to maintain. The qualities that feel too dangerous to carry openly, the desires that seem inappropriate, the impulses that conflict with how you understand yourself to be, the parts that were, at some point, quietly placed aside, not destroyed, not resolved, just stored somewhere below the level of daily awareness where they would not cause trouble. Jung's observation was that the shadow does not stay still. It does not simply wait in storage. It finds expression in other ways. And one of the most reliable ways it finds expression is in other people. Specifically, in the people we react to most strongly. When a quality we have buried in ourselves appears openly in someone else, we do not see it as ours. We have no reason to. We set it aside a long time ago. But the reaction it produces is disproportionate because what we are responding to is not just them. We are responding to something that was ours once, or that we wanted to make ours once and did not. And that history generates a charge that ordinary irritation does not carry. Jung called the mechanism projection. The interior content gets placed outward onto someone visible, where it becomes the property of the other person rather than a reflection of anything internal. It can look like accurate perception. It can feel like it. But underneath the certainty, there is almost always something unresolved asking to be noticed. The irritation is real. The reaction is real. None of this makes the feeling false. But the source is not always where it appears to be. And this is not a comfortable idea. It asks something specific of the person sitting with it. It asks them to consider that the story they have been constructing, the case with its evidence and its logic, might be doing two jobs simultaneously. One job is describing someone else. The other job is protecting something the person cannot quite look at yet. Jung was not arguing that every dislike is projection. Not every irritation is a mirror. Some people genuinely cause difficulty. Some behavior genuinely warrants a response. The point is not to convert all friction into self-examination and let everyone off the hook. The point is to notice a particular quality of reaction. The kind that feels too sustained, too layered, too personally charged to be entirely about the other person. The kind where the specific thing that cannot be tolerated happens to be something that was once wanted, or once lived more freely in the self, and at some point was taught to disappear. In this case, the freedom to be visible. The ease of speaking without spending 20 minutes first deciding whether the words deserve to be heard. The absence of the long internal audit that has become so habitual it no longer feels like an audit at all, just normal thinking. That was the thing in the shadow, not a flaw in the self, not a deficiency. Simply a part of the self that learned across enough time and enough small corrections that it was safer to be quiet. And with that comes a slow, unwelcome recognition. The irritation was not wrong in the sense of being invented. The feeling was real, the reaction genuine, but it was aimed in the wrong direction. What it was pointing at was not arrogance, not obliviousness, not some quality of theirs that deserved the response it was getting. It was pointing at permission, at a kind of freedom that had become unfamiliar enough to feel threatening. Because when a habit is practiced long enough, it stops feeling like a habit. It starts to feel like temperament, like the natural shape of a person. The careful editing, the constant measuring of space and sound and how much is too much, at some point that becomes indistinguishable from who you are. And when someone else moves through the world without that editing, without that ongoing self-management, the contrast is jarring in a way that is hard to name. It does not feel like envy exactly. It feels like criticism. The mind translates it as criticism because that is a less exposing interpretation. Envy requires acknowledging a want. Criticism only requires a standard. But underneath the criticism, if you stay with it long enough, the want is there. The want to say things without pre-clearing them, to occupy space without monitoring whether it is proportionate, to be visible without the low-grade anxiety that visibility tends to bring. This is hard to sit with. There is a part of the mind that pushes back immediately, that would prefer the case against the other person to remain clean and external. Because if the irritation is pointing inward, then something has to be examined. And what has to be examined is not comfortable. It is the record of everything that was set aside, and why, and how early the setting aside began. The question is not whether the other person is difficult. Maybe they are. That question can stay open, unanswered, without it mattering much to what is actually at stake here. The question that carries more weight is quieter. It is about what has been stored, how long it has been stored, what it costs to store it, and what it continues to cost. The shadow does not form because something is wrong with a person. Jung was clear about that. It forms because a person learned through experience which parts of themselves were acceptable in the spaces they inhabited and which parts were not. A child who is told in 100 different ways that their loudness is inconvenient learns to be quiet. A young person who is corrected steadily for taking up too much intellectual space learns to wait for permission. The learning is not dramatic. It happens in accumulation. And after enough accumulation, the buried part begins to seem like it was never there. But it was there, it still is. And when it encounters itself in someone else, still alive and unedited, still moving through the world with the ease that it lost, it does not recognize itself. It reacts. That flinch is not judgment. It is recognition that has not yet become conscious. So here is what the feeling actually is, stripped of the story that was built around it. Not a personality conflict, not a reliable read of someone else's character, not discernment, not clarity, not the product of good judgment about a difficult person. Something older, a habit of self-reduction that was practiced long enough to become invisible, and a reaction that keeps surfacing because something underneath it is still trying to get a signal through. The person at work did not cause this. They did not plant it or awaken it or make it what it is. They simply existed in a way that made the contrast impossible to ignore. Their ease held up a kind of mirror, and the reflection in that mirror was not flattering, not because it showed something ugly, but because it showed something that had been missing for a long time. There is no resolution available here that arrives quickly or cleanly. No single realization that reorganizes everything. What is available is something smaller and more durable than resolution. A slightly more honest relationship with the discomfort. A willingness to let it mean something different than what it first appeared to mean. The irritation does not have to disappear for this to matter. The other person does not have to become easier or more likable or suddenly admirable. None of that is required. What is required is only this, the recognition that some portion of what has been felt for months was not really about them at all. It was a signal from a part of the self that has been waiting quietly for a long time for someone to finally notice it is still there. And maybe that is the smallest thing worth carrying forward. Not an answer, not a plan, just an acknowledgement that the things we find most intolerable in other people are sometimes the things we have most quietly given up in ourselves. You do not hate them. You are grieving a version of yourself that never quite got to exist in the open. This does not mean the irritation vanishes. It does not mean you have to become fond of them or find them less grating or revise the whole story. It just means you know a little more about where the feeling is coming from, and knowing changes things, not loudly, not completely, just a small degree of shift in how you hold it. The shadow is not something to defeat. Jung never suggested that. It is something to know. To gradually, honestly bring into view, not because it makes everything easier, because it makes you a little more whole and a little more honest about what you are actually looking at when you look at someone else. There is something worth sitting with in that, even if it is slow, even if it is uncomfortable, even if the recognition arrives long after you thought the case was closed. It is still worth sitting with.